A ranger disappeared for 4 days in Portlock, Alaska, and when he returned screaming, "Bigfoot is not a myth," the government buried his story. This 20-year veteran found something in October 2019 that shouldn't exist, a structure 60 feet up. In the trees, tools made of bone and 18-inch barefoot tracks in fresh snow. When rescued, he was clutching reddish-brown hair samples. His service weapon bent into a U-shape while still holstered, requiring 2,000 pounds of pressure. He kept repeating, "It could have killed me 50 times over. It chose not to." What ancient intelligence did he encounter in those abandoned woods? You found your way here for a reason. In a world that can feel overwhelming, it's the gentle hearts that bring light, and yours is one of them. I've been a ranger with the Alaska Park Service for 20 years, but that October morning briefing at Kodiak Station felt different. The familiar smell of coffee and wet Gore-Tex gear filled the ready room. As I reviewed the incident reports spread across my desk, steam rising from my thermos into the pre-dawn darkness outside the windows. "Thorne, you're our best bet for this one," Station Chief Martinez said, sliding another manila folder across my desk. 3 separate groups in 2 weeks, all experienced hikers, all reporting the same thing near Portlock. I nodded, already knowing where this was headed. Portlock had been abandoned in the 1950s, and the ruins had always drawn a certain kind of tourist, the kind looking for stories to tell back home. But these reports were different. "Wood knocks?" I asked, scanning the first page of witness statements. "Started about a quarter mile from the old cannery site," Martinez confirmed. All 3 groups reported the same pattern, sharp, deliberate sounds that seemed to follow them for miles. 2 of the groups cut their trips short and headed back to the trailhead. The 3rd group pushed on, but reported the knocking got more aggressive the further they went. I've handled my share of strange cases over the years. When you spend enough time in Alaska's backcountry, you learn to take witness reports seriously, even when they seem improbable. I've tracked grizzlies through avalanche zones, led search parties through whiteout conditions, and documented enough unusual phenomena to fill a library. But something about these reports made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "There's more," Martinez said, pointing to the last page. "Local guide found these tracks yesterday morning, after the first snow." The photographs showed a series of barefoot prints in fresh powder, each measuring nearly 18 inches in length. The stride length and depth suggested something of considerable weight, but the shape was unmistakably humanoid. What caught my attention wasn't just the size, it was the precision. These weren't the smeared marks of a hoax. They showed clear toe definition and natural gait patterns. "None of the local guides will go near the area now," Martinez continued. "They're saying it's Nantiinak territory." I kept my expression neutral, but the mention of Nantiinak, the native name for what others called Bigfoot, brought back memories I'd rather forget. My father had vanished in these same woods in 1987, during what should have been a routine patrol. His body was never found. "I'll need a full kit," I said, reaching for my satellite phone to check the battery. "Weather forecast?" "Early. Snow, temperatures ranging from 35 during the day to around 20 at night. You'll have about 10 hours of usable daylight. Nearest backup is 12 miles out, and cell coverage is spotty at best. Satellite phone and your emergency beacon will be your only reliable comms." I ran through my mental checklist. Glock 20 with 10 mini-psion rounds for bear defense, flare gun, bear spray, trauma kit, my weatherproof notebook for documentation, and the Garmin InReach for GPS tracking. 72 hours of supplies should be enough for a thorough investigation. "The Park Service wants this handled quietly," Martinez added. "We've got enough tourist traffic dropping off with winter coming. No need to start a panic. Document everything, but keep it official." I understood the subtext. In 20 years of service, I'd privately recorded 3 similar incidents at other posts, but never included them in official reports. This job requires a delicate balance between protecting the public and protecting your credibility. No one wants to be the ranger who cried Bigfoot. "I'll head out at first light," I said, gathering the reports. "Have we cleared this with local, tribal authorities?" Martinez nodded. "They're aware but not involved. Said something about it being the wrong time of year to disturb certain areas. Read into that what you will." As I organized my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that these incidents were building towards something. The woodknocks were textbook territorial behavior, but the escalating aggression suggested a change in pattern. Whatever was out there wasn't just passing through, it was defending its ground. "One more thing, Bradley," Martinez said as I stood to leave. "These coordinates you're heading to, they're less than 5 miles from where your father was last seen." I paused, letting that sink in. 20 years of experience told me to approach this like any other investigation. Document, analyze, report. But standing there in the pre-dawn, darkness, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the ranger station coming to life, I knew this assignment would be different. Not because of what I might find, but because of what I'd spent my entire career trying not to remember. Before heading to Portlock, I made a crucial stop in Port Graham, a small native village that held historical ties to the abandoned settlement. The tribal office had provided a contact, Elder Thomas Moonin, who agreed to meet me at his modest home overlooking the bay. I spread the historical documents across his kitchen table, newspaper clippings, weather-worn photographs, and official reports from 1949. The images showed Portlock in its final days: a cannery, a post office, scattered houses, and 31 residents who would soon abandon everything they'd built. "You shouldn't go there," Moonin said quietly, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he pushed a cup of tea toward me. "Not now. The signs are the same as before." "Before?" I prompted, keeping my voice neutral. As a cultural liaison for state agencies and a documented source for the University of Alaska's Oral History Project, Moonin spoke 3 native dialects and carried the weight of generations of local knowledge. He wouldn't meet my eyes. 1949. We lost 4 people that year. The logger, Peterson, they found pieces of him scattered across half a mile. The official report said, "bear attack," but I saw those photos before they sealed them. No bear could manage that kind of... He shook his head, leaving the sentence unfinished. I pulled out my notebook, trying to maintain the professional distance that 20 years of service had taught me. The other victims? 2 hunters never came back. The 4th... He paused, his hands shaking more visibly now. The 4th was found in the water. The body was intact, but the face... Again, he left the details unspoken. "Your grandfather was there?" I asked, referencing my notes from the tribal office. Moonin nodded, still avoiding direct eye contact. He was on night watch at the cannery during the last storm before everyone left. Said he saw it through the snow, walking upright, taller than any doorway. It was carrying a full-grown seal like a child carries a doll. He finally looked up, his eyes sharp despite his age. The seal was still alive, crying out. Then it wasn't. Did others see? "We don't speak of what others saw," he cut me off. "Some knowledge isn't meant for reports and files. My grandfather's generation had an understanding with them. Boundaries, respect. But the young ones now, they don't listen. They go where they shouldn't, take pictures, make noise." He gestured at my documentation. "They treat it like a story, for their friends." "And the woodknocks we're hearing now?" "Warnings," he said simply. "Like before. First the sounds, then the tracks, then..." He pushed his chair back from the table. "I've told you more than I should. The rest is up to you, Ranger Thorne. But remember, some places are empty for a reason." The October wind cut across the bay as I guided the patrol boat toward Portlock's deteriorating dock. Even from 100 yards out, the abandoned settlement carried a weight that pressed against my chest. A sensation I'd learned to respect over 2 decades in the wilderness. Nature reclaims empty places quickly in Alaska, but something felt different here. Wrong. I secured the boat and double-checked my gear. Glock 20 on my hip, bear spray accessible, satellite phone charged. The standard equipment felt inadequate as I surveyed the ghost town. Collapsed structures dotted the shoreline, their weathered timber frames reaching toward the grey sky like skeletal fingers. The cannery's remains stood as the centerpiece, its rusted machinery still visible through broken walls. The silence hit me first. In 20 years of backcountry work, I'd never encountered such a complete absence of sound. No ravens calling from the spruce tops. No ground squirrels darting between cover. No small birds working the brush. The forest that pressed against the town's edges seemed to absorb sound rather than create it. I began my systematic documentation, photographing the settlement's layout and noting GPS coordinates. The weather was holding at 35 degrees Fahrenheit with light cloud cover, decent conditions for tracking. That's when I found them, leading from the tide line. Footprints. Years of wildlife assessment kicked in as I dropped to one knee, measuring tape in hand. 18 inches from heel to toe. The impressions were crisp in the mixture of sand and early snow, showing clear anatomical detail. 5 toes, a distinct arch, a wide ball of the foot, human-like, but massively scaled up. I photographed each print with a ruler for scale, plotting their course. The stride length made me check my measurements twice. 5 feet, 10 inches between prints. Even a running human in full stride rarely exceeds half that distance. The tracks led directly from the water toward the tree line. Following the trail brought me to another anomaly. Several spruce trees along the path showed extensive bark stripping between 8 and 12 feet high, well above bear height. I've documented hundreds of cases of bears marking trees, but this was different. The bark had been systematically removed, and the exposed wood showed distinct tooth marks. I pressed my digital caliper into the deepest grooves, 2.8 inches between cusps, nearly triple the width of a large brown bear's dentition. I collected samples and documented everything according to protocol, but my hands weren't quite steady as I made the measurements. The forest's unnatural silence pressed closer, and I found myself checking my 6 more often than I'd care to admit. 2 decades of experience told me I was being watched, but for the first time in my career, I couldn't identify what was doing the watching. I established my base camp 2 miles inland. Before sunset, selecting a defensible position on a slight rise with good sightlines. 20 years of backcountry experience had taught me to trust my instincts about locations, and something kept pushing me to maintain clear escape routes. I set up my 4-season tent with mechanical precision. Each stake driven deep, every line tensioned perfectly. The temperature dropped to 23 degrees Fahrenheit as darkness settled. I had my satellite phone, emergency beacon, and audio recording equipment arranged within arm's reach of my sleeping bag. The forest's silence remained absolute. No owl calls, no voles rustling through the leaf litter, nothing. At 22:17, the first knock came, a sharp crack like a baseball bat against a hollow tree, perhaps half a mile to the northwest. I activated my digital recorder and checked the gain levels. 7 minutes later, another knock answered from the southeast, closer. I made myself breathe slowly, documenting times and estimated distances in my weatherproof notebook. The pattern continued for 43 minutes, knocks that seemed to triangulate my position, moving in a roughly circular pattern. When I shifted position in my tent, the knocking would pause, then resume from new locations. This wasn't random, it was coordinated movement. At 23:04, my audio equipment picked up something else. A low-frequency vocalization at the edge of human hearing, more felt than heard. The spectrogram analysis on my field laptop showed it centered around 12 Hz, well below what most consumer equipment could capture. It lasted for 18 seconds. First light couldn't come soon enough. I waited until 06:30 to emerge, checking my weapon and surroundings before starting my equipment retrieval route. I'd set up 6 trail cameras the previous day in a standard grid pattern, each carefully positioned and GPS marked. The first camera had been rotated 180 degrees to face the tree trunk it was mounted on. The second faced the ground. By the third, my hands were shaking slightly as I documented the pattern. All 6 cameras had been deliberately repositioned but not damaged or stolen. The memory cards were untouched. I downloaded the footage immediately. 5 cameras showed nothing but trees and shadows before being moved. The 6th caught something at 02:47, a dark mass at the extreme edge of the infrared range. The shape suggested height and mass well beyond any known wildlife in the region, but the image quality was too poor for definitive analysis. I noted the timestamp and location in my log, trying to maintain professional detachment, even as my mind raced through implications I wasn't ready to face. The stench hit me first, that sickly sweet decay that every ranger knows. But something was off about it, layers of decomposition that shouldn't exist together. I documented my approach carefully, taking GPS coordinates and photographs as I moved forward. 3 adult grizzly carcasses lay in a perfect equilateral triangle, roughly 30 feet apart. My initial assessment showed they'd died weeks apart. The first was mostly skeletal, the second in advanced decomposition, but the third couldn't have been dead more than 7 days. Yet the ground disturbance patterns indicated all 3 had been positioned here within the last 48 hours. I knelt beside the most recent kill, keeping my Glock ready. The chest cavity had been opened with precision I'd never seen in predator kills. Specific organs had been removed: heart, liver, and what appeared to be the thyroid gland. The cuts showed clear tool marks, not tooth or claw patterns. I photographed everything, using my rangefinder for scale. "Base, this is Thorn." I spoke into my satellite phone. "I need a forensics team at my location." Only static answered. The phone showed full signal, but when I pulled it from its case, my stomach dropped. Deep gouges ran across the hardened casing, gouges that hadn't been there that morning. The phone still powered on, but couldn't connect. I checked my bear-proof container where I'd stored it during my survey. The locked mechanism was intact, but there were stress marks around the edges I hadn't noticed before. Something had accessed it without actually breaking the lock. 20 yards north of the carcasses, I found the structure. Something, had stacked fallen logs into a crude lean-to, large enough to shelter something 8 to 10 feet tall. The precision of the stacking suggested intelligence, with smaller branches woven between larger logs for stability. This wasn't random debris. I documented everything according to protocol, fighting to keep my hands steady as I measured and photographed. The sun was already low, and I needed to make decisions about tomorrow's route. The evidence pointed deeper, into the wilderness, following an old mining trail that showed recent signs of large bipedal traffic. Back at my camp, I double-checked my remaining equipment. The damaged satellite phone could still display GPS coordinates, but wouldn't transmit. My emergency beacon remained functional, my last reliable link to the outside world. I plotted my route for the next day, marking the mining trail and potential fallback positions. As darkness approached, I found myself obsessively checking and rechecking my gear. The systematic way the carcasses had been arranged, the precise removal of organs, the structure built to accommodate something far larger than any known predator. It all pointed to a level of intelligence I wasn't prepared to acknowledge. The morning of day 3 greeted me with a thin layer of frost coating my tent. I broke camp efficiently, double-checking my GPS coordinates before heading northwest along a well-worn game trail. The early October air bit through my jacket as I documented my starting position. Elevation 1,200 feet, approximately 4 miles, inland from the abandoned Portlock settlement. The first markers appeared about an hour into my hike. Young saplings, no more than 3 inches in diameter, had been twisted into complex spiral patterns, not broken or bent, twisted, with the living wood somehow coaxed into impossible shapes. I photographed each one, noting how they seemed to increase in frequency as I moved deeper into the territory. By mid-morning, I encountered the first rock formations. As a veteran ranger, I'm familiar with natural rockfalls and glacial deposits, but these were different. Boulders weighing hundreds of pounds had been stacked into delicate towers, some reaching heights of 12 feet or more. The precision required to balance them this way defied explanation. No wind or natural process could have created these structures. They would have collapsed at the slightest disturbance. The smell hit me around noon, an overwhelming musk that made my eyes water, mixed with the sweet rot of decay. But it wasn't stationary. One moment it seemed to come from my left, then it would shift behind me, then ahead. I've tracked every predator in Alaska, but I'd never encountered scent-marking behavior like this. At 14:37 hours, I reached a clearing dominated by old-growth spruce. The trees here were giants, their lowest branches starting 40 feet up. That's when I saw it. My hands shook slightly as I keyed my radio for what would be my final transmission of the day. Base, this is Thorn. I've located some kind of structure, approximately 60 feet up in a spruce cluster. It appears to be constructed from woven branches and... I paused, struggling to maintain professional detachment. And what looks like stripped bark used as binding material. The construction suggests tool use and advanced planning. I'm proceeding with documentation. Using my zoom lens, I captured initial photos from the ground. The structure was enormous, easily 20 feet across, anchored between 3 massive spruce trees. It wasn't a random collection of debris. This was architecture, crude but intentional. Found a viable climbing route and began my ascent, stopping every few feet to photograph my progress. The smell grew stronger as I climbed. At the structure's level, I could see it had multiple chambers, with distinct areas that appeared to serve different purposes. What I found inside made me question everything I thought I knew about North American wildlife. Primitive tools lined one section, stone hammers with bone handles, scrapers made from shoulder blades of what looked like moose or elk, and cutting implements fashioned from sharp rocks bound to carved wooden grips with what appeared to be braided animal sinew. I documented everything meticulously, knowing the importance of what I was seeing. But as I raised my camera for the final series of shots, the screen went black. I checked the battery. It had been at full charge when I started climbing. Now it was completely dead, not even responding to the power button. The backup battery in my pack showed the same status. The silence around me suddenly seemed absolute. No wind in the branches, no birds, no small animals moving through the underbrush, just complete, unnatural silence. I keyed my radio again at 14:30 hours, my breath visible in the cooling afternoon air. Base, Thorn reporting, currently 12 miles inland from Portlock settlement, elevation 2,400 feet. I paused to check my GPS coordinates before continuing. I've located fresh tracks heading toward Devil's Gap Canyon system. They match the pattern and dimensions documented at the beach site, but show deeper impression depths, suggesting increased mass or speed. Static crackled through the radio before Delia's voice came through. Copy that, Bradley. Those tracks are leading you pretty deep into... Her voice cut out for several seconds. Weather system moving in from the northwest. What's your visibility? Clear. For now, but I can see the cloud bank you're talking about. Should have about 3 hours of good light left. I'm going to follow these tracks while they're fresh. They show clear directionality and purpose. Whatever made them was moving with intention, not foraging. Bradley, be advised we're getting some unusual interference on your signal. Can you verify your last transmission about the tree's star? The radio squealed with harsh feedback, forcing me to pull the handset away from my ear. Delia, you're breaking up. Please repeat last message. Only fragments came through. Structure location. More static. Similar pattern when... Another burst of interference. Previous reports. I adjusted the radio's frequency, slightly trying to clear the signal. Base, if you can hear me, I'm proceeding to investigate the tracks. We'll establish contact again at 1600 hours. The radio emitted one final burst of static before going silent. I checked the battery level, still showing nearly full charge. The signal strength indicator also showed adequate coverage for our satellite system. Something else was causing the interference. I switched to my backup radio. Base, Thorn on secondary channel. Radio check, over. Nothing but the same strange static. I made a note in my weatherproof notebook about the communication issues, including the time and circumstances. The tracks led toward a narrow ravine that served as the entrance to Devil's Gap. Fresh snow from 2 days ago made them easy to follow, each print clearly defined, showing the same distinctive characteristics I'd documented earlier. 18 inches long, 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot, with a mid-tarsal break that suggested a flexible, non-human arch structure. What struck me most was their deliberate placement. These weren't the wandering tracks of an animal following, game, or foraging. They moved in an almost straight line, each step precisely placed, maintaining that impossible 6-foot stride length, even across broken terrain. I photographed several of the clearest prints, including my radio and GPS unit, in frame for scale reference. The temperature was dropping as the cloud bank approached, and I knew the tracks wouldn't last long if the weather turned. I had to move quickly if I wanted to. The radio suddenly crackled to life with Delia's voice, cutting through static. "Bradley, if you can hear this, we're seeing a pattern in the interference. Every time you've reported specific findings, particularly that tree structure, our equipment..." The transmission dissolved into harsh electronic noise before cutting out completely. I checked both radios again. Dead silence on all channels. The cloud bank was moving faster now, dark and heavy with snow. I took one last look at the tracks leading into Devil's Gap, then checked my watch. 14:45 hours. Time was running out. I remember checking my watch one final time. 1500 hours. The snow had started falling in earnest, thick flakes that would soon obscure the tracks I'd been following. I had just shouldered my pack to turn back when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in these woods, not a branch breaking or rock sliding, but something deliberate. 3 distinct knocks, spaced exactly 2 seconds apart, echoing off the canyon walls. My hand went instinctively to the Glock on my hip. 20 years of backcountry experience told me to retreat, to wait out whatever was happening from a defensive position. But then I saw it. Movement at the edge of my peripheral vision, something massive shifting between the trees about 60 yards up the slope. I pulled out my satellite phone to document my position, but the screen was black despite being fully charged minutes earlier. When I tried to power it on, the casing crackled and compressed in my hand, as if subjected to enormous pressure. I dropped it back into my pack, hearing components shifting loosely inside the crushed frame. The knocking came again, closer this time, followed by a sound I can only describe as breathing. Deep, rhythmic respirations that no bear or moose could produce. I unholstered my sidearm and began moving back down the trail, maintaining visual contact with my surroundings. That's when my tent came into view through the thickening snow. I'd left it secured and double-staked against the wind, but now the heavy-duty fabric was shredded in long, parallel tears. Not the random destruction of a scavenging animal. These cuts followed a pattern, methodically spaced as if testing the material's strength. My gear lay scattered, some items crushed, others seemingly examined and discarded. I activated my emergency beacon, knowing it would alert the station. The confirmation light blinked twice before going dark. I pressed it again, and again it died, after just moments of transmission. My hands shook as I tried a third time, watching the signal light flicker and fade. Something warm trickled down my arm, blood from where branches had torn at me during my retreat, though I had no memory of those injuries occurring. More blood marked the trees behind me, documenting a path of desperate movement through the undergrowth that I couldn't clearly recall. Looking up, I saw broken branches and torn bark at heights of 10, 12, even 15 feet, evidence of something massive moving at speed through the forest canopy. My pack felt lighter. Equipment I'd started with was missing. First aid kit, spare ammunition, emergency flares. I must have dropped them during moments that now existed only as blank spaces in my memory. The snow was falling harder, but I could still make out impressions in the fresh powder. My own boot prints, chaotic and stumbling, interspersed with those other tracks. The 18-inch prints I'd been documenting were no longer following a straight line, but showed signs of pursuit, their stride length increasing to nearly 8 feet in places. The knocking echoed through the canyon again, this time answered by another set of impacts from a different direction. They were coordinating, moving to flank my position. I had to keep moving, had to maintain enough awareness to document what was happening. My training demanded I record everything, even as instinct screamed at me to run. I was reviewing the last known coordinates from Thorne's emergency beacon when Captain Alexander Petrov strode into the command center, his weathered face tight. with concern. 4 helicopters, 12 ground personnel, and we can't maintain reliable bearings in half the search grid, he reported, tapping his wedding ring against the map table. A nervous habit I'd noticed whenever something didn't add up. Bože moi, he muttered in Russian, spreading out the morning's search patterns. Look at these compass readings. 3 different teams reported their instruments spinning when they entered this valley system. He circled an area with his finger. Good equipment, experienced personnel. This doesn't happen, the radio crackled. Base, this is Team Charlie. We're pulling back from grid sector 7, taking heavy impacts from thrown rocks. Professional climbing gear would be needed to access these ridge lines, but there's no one up there. Precision. Hits on our position. Request immediate extraction. Petrov grabbed the radio. Charlie, confirm your coordinates. He switched to a different channel. Helo 2, divert to Sector 7 for emergency pickup. I watched through the command center windows as one of the Coast Guard helicopters banked sharply, heading toward Yield, the extraction point. The pilot's voice came through clearly. Base, be advised we're seeing unusual canopy movement in the valleys below. Large shadows tracking west to east, but thermal imaging shows nothing. Repeat, no heat signatures despite clear visual movement. Clear visual movement. Petrov pulled out an old Soviet-era compass from his pocket, comparing it to the modern GPS unit on his belt. In my 15 years of Arctic rescue, I've never seen equipment fail like this. Not in these patterns. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The shadows, they follow our search teams. Every time we establish a pattern, something shifts to block our access. The afternoon briefing brought more inexplicable reports. 2 ground teams described coordinated wood knocks that seemed to pace them through the forest, sharp impacts that responded to their movements and maintained consistent distance despite changing terrain. The sounds formed a perimeter, herding the searchers away from certain areas. The valley goes dark, one team leader reported, pointing to his sector on the map. Blue sky overhead, but down in the trees, it's like something massive is moving through the canopy. Not clouds, not weather. Something blocking the light in synchronized patterns. Petrov's formality increased with each new report, his language becoming precisely measured. We are experiencing atmospheric anomalies that affect both visibility and equipment reliability. Multiple teams have encountered organized resistance to their movements, including projectiles launched from tactically advantageous positions that show evidence of intelligence in their targeting. He turned to the window, watching another helicopter return for refueling. I've coordinated over 200 successful rescues in Alaska. Never lost anyone when we had a clear weather window like this. He touched his compass again, but something is actively preventing us from maintaining an effective search pattern. Something that understands our methods well enough to counter them. The radio crackled again with another team requesting extraction, their voices tight with controlled fear as they described more wood knocks closing in around their position. Petrov's jaw clenched as he gave the order to pull them out, adding another red X to the map where our search efforts had been systematically blocked. The devils, club tore at my flesh as I crawled through the undergrowth, each barbed spine adding to the constellation of wounds across my arms and face. My training screamed at me to maintain direction, but my compass had been spinning wildly for hours. The whistles started again, 3 distinct tones triangulating my position with horrifying precision. One high-pitched, one low and guttural, and one that seemed to modulate between frequencies in a way that made my teeth ache. They were herding me. 20 years of tracking predators in Alaska's backcountry, and now I was being manipulated like prey. Every time I veered east, trying to circle back toward the coast, the whistles intensified until I had no choice but to move inland, toward the cliffs I could barely make out in the growing darkness. My flashlight was the next to go. I'd kept it off, preserving battery life, but the moment I clicked it on to check my footing near a ravine, something massive shifted in the canopy above. The stones struck with surgical precision, shattering the lens and electronics in one hit. They'd waited for me to reveal my position. They'd known exactly what the light was, what it meant to me. Hours bled together. My satellite phone was crushed, emergency beacon disabled, GPS unit dead. Each piece of technology had been systematically targeted, destroyed in ways that showed deliberate understanding of their function. The only reason I still had my Glock was because I'd never drawn it. They were waiting for me to reveal my last advantages. The cave opening appeared suddenly, a black maw in the cliff face barely visible in the twilight. Pure survival instinct drove me inside, away from the whistles that had grown closer with each passing hour. The beam from my backup penlight revealed rough stone walls extending about 30 feet back. I wasn't alone. The remains were propped against the far wall, partially mummified in the cold, dry air. The clothing was preserved enough to recognize. A dark blue uniform with brass buttons, Portlock General Store, still barely legible on the name tag. 1940s cut and style, matching the period when the town was abandoned. The bones were scattered, in a way that suggested violence, but it was the walls that made my blood run cold. Hundreds of scratches covered the stone surface, too regular to be natural, too precise to be random. They formed patterns, crude lines and shapes that radiated out from a central point. Some marks were deeply gouged, others lighter, creating what looked like elevation changes. My fingers traced one line that matched the coastline perfectly, another that followed the river valley I'd been forced to abandon. It was a map, or a warning, or both. The scratches showed features I recognized from my own topographical surveys, but with additions. Circles marked with X's that corresponded to locations where hikers had reported encounters, lines that seemed to indicate movement patterns. In the center, a series of interconnected symbols I didn't recognize, repeated in careful rows, like text or pictographs. A stone clattered at the cave entrance. The whistles had stopped, replaced by something worse, the sound of breathing. Heavy, rhythmic breathing from multiple sources, just outside my shelter. They'd driven me here deliberately, to this cave, to this message left by someone who'd made the same desperate choices I had. I pressed myself against the wall beside the ancient remains, my hand finally moving to my holster. The breathing grew closer. The first grey light of dawn filtered through the cave entrance, revealing nothing but silence where the breathing had been. My muscles screamed from holding still for hours, cramped against the cold stone. I knew I had to move. Staying meant certain death from exposure, if nothing else. I edged toward the entrance, my training warring with instinct. Every fiber of my being screamed to stay hidden, but 20 years of wilderness experience told me dawn was my best chance. Predators typically rest after a night of hunting, but this was no ordinary predator. The morning mist clung to the ground in patches, visibility clear to about 60 yards. That's when I saw it, standing perfectly upright against a massive spruce, 40 feet from the cave entrance. No attempt at concealment, no predatory crouch, just waiting. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. The proportions were wrong. Shoulders too wide, arms too long, head set directly on those shoulders with almost no neck. But it was the eyes that shattered my reality. Dark, deep set, under a heavy brow ridge. They tracked my every micro-movement with unmistakable intelligence. When my hand instinctively moved toward my Glock, those eyes flicked down to my holster, then back to my face. A clear message. It knew exactly what my weapon was. My fingers touched the grip, and a low sound emanated from the creature. Not quite a growl, more like the subsonic rumble of distant artillery. I had a choice to make. Drawing would commit me to a confrontation. Wasn't sure I could win. The creature's muscle mass alone suggested strength far beyond human capacity, and something about those eyes told me it was evaluating my choices, just as carefully as I was evaluating its presence. Slowly, deliberately, I removed my hand from the holster. The rumbling ceased. I took one step to the side, telegraphing my intent to walk a wide arc around the tree where it stood. The creature responded by taking a single step away from the trunk, maintaining the same distance but clearing a path. We moved in this careful dance for perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. When I reached the point where the trail curved back toward the coast, I allowed myself to turn slightly away, keeping the creature in my peripheral vision. It remained motionless, watching. Only when I'd put 100 yards between us did I reach, again for my sidearm, not to draw but to verify its presence for my own comfort. My fingers found the holster intact, but the hard shape inside was wrong. I walked another quarter mile before I dared to look. The Glock was bent into a perfect U-shape, the barrel nearly touching the grip. The metal showed no stress marks, no scratches, just a smooth, impossible curve that would have required at least 2,000 pounds of focused pressure to achieve. Yet the holster itself was unmarked. No scuffs, no stretching, no indication of the immense force that had been applied with surgical precision while the weapon was secured to my hip. I thought back to my satellite phone, crushed inside an undamaged pack, my flashlight, struck with sniper-like accuracy. Each piece of technology systematically neutralized. This wasn't just strength. This was methodical intelligence. And I had been allowed to leave. The thrum of rotor blades penetrated my fog of exhaustion. I stumbled along the ridgeline, one hand trailing against rough bark to stay upright, the other clutched tight around the samples I'd found near the cave entrance. Coarse, reddish-brown hair, unlike anything in my 2 decades of wildlife experience, too thick for bear, too long for moose, with a peculiar texture that seemed to shift between bristly and soft. The Coast Guard MH-60 Jayhawk appeared through the morning haze, hovering above the tree line before spotting my position. I must have been quite a sight. Uniform shredded, covered in Devil's Club scratches, barely able to walk. But I was alive. That fact kept echoing in my mind. I was alive because it chose not to kill me. The rescue basket descended, and I practically fell into it, still maintaining my death grip on the hair samples. The crew chief's voice crackled through his helmet as they hauled me up. "Ranger Thorne, are you injured? Can you respond?" I managed a weak thumbs up, though everything hurt. The bruising had settled in during my long walk. Symmetrical patterns around my arms and legs where it had grabbed me, tested me, but never crushed. Like a child learning how much pressure breaks a toy. Once inside the helicopter, the medical team swarmed over me. I heard fragments of their assessment through the fog of exhaustion. Severe dehydration, multiple contusions, these marks on the vest. I looked down at my Kevlar vest, seeing it for the first time in full light. 4 parallel gouges ran across the front, spaced wider than any bear's claws could reach. The material wasn't torn, it was compressed, as if enormous pressure had been applied with surgical precision. "Sir, we need to start an IV. Can you release what you're holding?" I shook my head, clutching the samples tighter. "Evidence," I croaked through cracked lips. "Need to document." They tried 3 more times to get me to let go as they hooked up the IV and checked my vitals. Even when they administered the sedative, I maintained my grip. These samples were proof, not just of existence, but of intelligence. The creature had left them deliberately, just as it had deliberately spared my life. "It could have killed me 50 times over," I told the medic who was wrapping a pressure cuff around my arm. "During the chase, in the cave at dawn, 50 chances minimum. It chose not to." "Sir, you're safe now. Try to relax." "You don't understand," I insisted as the sedative began to take hold. "It wasn't hunting me. It was studying me. Testing me. The way it disabled the equipment, knew what each piece was for." The medic exchanged glances with his colleague. I recognized that look, the same one I'd given countless hikers reporting impossible things, but I didn't care. I had the samples, and more importantly, I had survived an encounter that proved these creatures weren't just real. They were far more intelligent than anyone had imagined. The last thing I remember before the sedative took full effect was opening my hand slightly, letting the coarse hair catch the morning light. Even half-conscious, I couldn't help but notice how the strands seemed to shimmer with an almost metallic quality that defied natural explanation. I regained full consciousness in Alaska Regional Hospital, surrounded by the sterile whites and beeping monitors that felt surreal after days in the wilderness. My room quickly filled with a mix of familiar and federal faces. Delia from the ranger station, 2 Fish and Wildlife officers, and a man who introduced himself only as Agent Cooper, from a department he wouldn't name. "Let's start from the beginning," Cooper said, setting up a digital recorder. "Focus on the equipment interference patterns." I shifted in the hospital bed, wincing at the deep bruising. It wasn't random destruction. It specifically targeted anything that could communicate or document. The satellite phone was crushed inside a locked bear container, but my food supplies in the same container weren't touched. My cameras were disabled one by one, always when I was documenting specific evidence. Delia caught my slip. "There were at least 3, I said firmly. The whistling during the chase came from multiple positions, coordinated, herding me toward the cliffs. They understood the search grid too, kept me moving through sectors just before the helicopter sweeps would reach them." Cooper leaned forward. "You're suggesting tactical awareness?" "I'm stating it explicitly," I replied. When the search teams came in, these things knew exactly how to stay in the visual shadows of the valleys. They threw rocks at searchers from positions that would have been impossible for humans to reach. They weren't just reacting, they were anticipating. The Fish and Wildlife officers exchanged glances. One of them, Dr. Harrison, opened a laptop. "We've completed preliminary analysis of the hair samples you recovered. The follicular structure shows primate characteristics, but..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There's no match to any known species in our database. The DNA sequencing is unusual." "Unusual how?" I pressed. "That information is now classified," Cooper cut in smoothly, "as is everything else about this investigation moving forward." "The public has a right to know what's out there," I protested. "These aren't just animals." The way my sidearm was bent, 2,000 pounds of focused pressure without damaging the holster. The strategic disabling of equipment. The fact that it chose not to kill me when it had dozens of opportunities. "Your official statement will reflect that you encountered an unknown predator species," Cooper stated flatly. "Any speculation about intelligence or coordinated behavior will be redacted." "There was nothing unknown about it," I said. "The Portlock locals knew. The native elders knew. We're the ones who've been blind." Cooper gathered his papers. "This meeting is concluded. You'll be contacted about signing the necessary non-disclosure agreements." He nodded to the others, and they filed out, leaving only Delia behind. She waited until the door closed. "The hair samples are already gone," she said quietly. "Transferred to some facility that doesn't officially exist. But I saw the initial results before they were sealed. Bradley, whatever you encountered out there." She shook her head. "The genetic markers suggested something that shouldn't be possible, something that bridges gaps in our evolutionary understanding." A nurse appeared in the doorway, ending our conversation. As Delia left, I stared out the window toward the distant mountains where Portlock lay. The bruises would heal, but the questions wouldn't fade. I'd seen something ancient and intelligent watching me from those woods. Something that had chosen to reveal itself, test me, and let me live to tell a story that would now be buried in bureaucratic shadows. 6 weeks after the Portlock incident, I submitted my resignation from the Alaska Park Service. 20 years of service ended with a single paragraph and a signature. The disability payments they offered stayed untouched in my account. Blood money for silence. I packed what little mattered and drove south to Oregon, where the forests were younger and held different secrets. The Anchorage Daily News caught up with me before I left. One reporter, Sarah Chen, cornered me outside my apartment. I gave her just enough to serve as a warning. Portlock isn't just dangerous, it's a permanent no-go zone. Whatever's out there has claimed that territory for longer than we've been. Keeping records, it's not just watching, it's waiting. I chose a small cabin outside of Bend, Oregon, remote enough for privacy, close enough to civilization that the silence didn't overwhelm me. The bruises had faded, but I still caught myself checking over my shoulder, measuring shadows against trees. 3 days after I settled in, Delia Vasquez showed up unannounced. She looked exhausted, like she'd driven straight through from Alaska. "They're burying everything," she said as soon as I opened the door. "The hair samples, the GPS data, your medical records, it's all been classified or lost in the system." I let her in, put on coffee. "Not everything," I said. She watched me retrieve a waterproof case from beneath a loose floorboard. Inside was my backup camera, the one they hadn't found when they collected my gear, the one I'd kept in a separate compartment of my pack. "They said all the photos were corrupted," Delia said, leaning forward. "They lied." I connected the camera to my laptop. I downloaded everything before they took the originals. Look, the first image, my boot print in fresh snow beside something that dwarfed it. 18 inches long, anatomically precise, with dermal ridges visible in the impression. "For scale," I said quietly. "That print belonged to something that mass and that intelligence shouldn't allow to exist." Next photo. Fresh carvings in a spruce trunk, geometric patterns that couldn't have been random. These weren't here the day before. They were marking their territory, or leaving messages. Delia's hand shook as I showed her the last image. My camp at dusk, tent in the foreground, trees beyond. And there, partially obscured by branches but unmistakable, a massive bipedal figure, easily 9 feet tall, watching. The photo was slightly blurred, but you could make out the proportions, the upright stance, the deliberate positioning. "It knew I was photographing it," I said. "Every time I raised the camera, it moved just enough to stay indistinct. This was the only clear shot I got, and I think it allowed it." "Why?" Delia whispered. "Same reason it let me live. Same reason it disabled my equipment instead of destroying it completely. It wanted witnesses, controlled witnesses. It wanted us to know it was there, but not enough to prove it conclusively. The agency will never let this get out," she said. "No," I agreed. "But they can't stop us from keeping the record. Someone needs to know the truth about what's out there." I kept tabs on Port Graham through contacts in the native community. Word spread quietly, but deliberately. The traditional boundary around Portlock expanded another 5 miles inland. Fishing boats took longer routes to avoid the coastline. There. When tourists asked about hiking trails, locals directed them elsewhere with practiced casualness. No dramatic warnings, just the time-tested wisdom of people who'd learned to coexist with something ancient and territorial. Delia's research landed in my inbox piece by piece. She'd been digging through digitized archives, connecting dots across decades of ranger reports. Similar incidents had been buried under bureaucratic paperwork. Rangers transferred, witnesses discredited, evidence lost. A 1973 case from Denali, where an entire research station was abandoned overnight. A 1995 incident in the Tongass National Forest, where 3 experienced trackers quit their jobs and moved to Hawaii. All classified, all showing the same pattern of equipment failure and strategic intimidation. The nightmares started in spring. Not the usual trauma-fueled replays of being hunted, but something worse, moments where I understood too clearly. I'd wake up sweating, the creature's final stance before me replaying with new meaning. It hadn't shown mercy by letting me live. It had issued a warning. I left a rambling message on Delia's voicemail at 3 a.m. Our drones, our thermal imaging, our cellular networks spreading through their territories. We're breaking something that can't be fixed. They've maintained this balance for centuries, staying just beyond proof, letting stories and fear keep their boundaries intact. But we keep pushing, keep trying to verify, to document. What happens when we force them into the open, when there's nowhere left to hide? The next day, I saw the announcement online. The Alaska Tourism Board had approved guided adventure tours to Portlock, marketing it as Alaska's most haunted ghost town. They ignored the unanimous protests from Port Graham's tribal council. They dismissed the petition signed by every ranger who'd served with me, warning of the area's dangers. I stared at my phone, thumb hovering over Delia's number. What could I say that would make any difference? The bureaucrats had their narrative. Just another burned-out ranger with PTSD, seeing monsters in the shadows. They'd keep pushing until something pushed back. Thank you for being part of this moment. I'll be here tomorrow, ready to share another story that comforts the soul.